if you want to ask a question in the middle of it, feel free, don't wait till the end to ask them. So I'm just going to give you a basic scope of what I'm going to talk about. This is a venture-related talk. So I wear a number of hats for Hearst. There are some people in this room that work for some of our companies. I'm going to talk a little bit about the enterprise technology side of what I do, but this is mainly venture-related. So I'm just going to go through the basic concepts of what I'm going to talk about. Basically, when a venture situation starts, whether it's funding or acquisition, there are numerous conversations that go on with your legal group, with your business analysts, and on the tech side, and I manage the tech side. So I use a scoping document to first start working with the company. In today's world, most conversations that start about investment go straight into acquisition as well. We've bought companies before when they were raising their Series A. So it depends on the circumstances with the entrepreneur, whether they want to become part of a big company. Because of the economic times, I think acquisition comes up in almost every meeting when you first start. What is your exit? When do you want to be acquired? I create a structured approach to the conversation. That's worked for me. I've done this sort of work since the early 90s. When we would want to partner with companies, we would want to take a stake in those companies, especially when I was at Dell, because as soon as Dell announced, or this company announced that we were doing something with them, their valuation would go through the roof, and so we wanted to share in that. And that was sort of in the early days of doing it. I'm mostly just going to focus on the technology and the product side. I can talk about the other sides because I sit through those meetings, but I primarily focus on evaluating the technology of the company, and because the product is really required, the technology is required for the product, then I spend time going through the evaluation of the products. Every business is different, so you sort of have to have a generic starting point, and then you fine-tune it through that conversation. That's why I really focus on the conversation. It's almost always CTO to CTO. When you talk about technology, if you're a seasoned technologist, it's hard to put things over on you. But there are times when you could have that happen. So you have to dig deeper sometimes. When I was at Time Warner, we had a pretty famous charlatan out of Australia that was trying to sell a Kodak, a revolutionary Kodak, to technology, telecommunications, and media companies. And he came in to meet with us, and it was phenomenal. His demo was amazing. We didn't believe it. And so we set up about 3 months of testing and evaluation to see if we could prove that he was faking it. And at the end, we just didn't feel like he was up front. Our test could never prove it. He ended up going to jail years later, long after I'd been in that role. But it's sort of, you get this gut feeling when you meet with people on whether they're up front or not. So the credibility side of what's going on is really important. And I open sourced this process I'm going to talk about a couple years ago because it is just a process. It's just a way to structure an evaluation. It's useful for VCs, entrepreneurs, and corporate folks that are doing this sort of work. So that's the scope of it. I'll go a little bit into my background. So Hearst is a private media company. We don't talk about where what our revenues are. There's a lot of guessing about what it is. We're definitely in the top 10 of diversified media companies, probably somewhere in the middle, if we measure ourselves against our peers. We're made up of 6 pretty traditional businesses: television, newspapers, magazines, business media, which is a B2B company, a lot of B2B businesses, entertainment and syndication, which is cable channels, so ESPN, Lifetime A&E, and then King Features, which is the largest cartoon syndicating company in the world, and then interactive media. And I'm part of interactive media. I wear a number of hats for them, but the primary function of interactive media is our venture group and enterprise technology. It's a corporate group, so we're the smallest division. We do throw off a lot of cash because we do venture, so we get the results of those things. we oversaw the ownership of iVillage, so when that was sold to NBC, that came through our group. And then we're mostly a domestic company. We do have some international businesses. Our magazines, of course, are known worldwide. We own a high percentage of Fitch Ratings. That's a French-based company. And then we have some funds, primarily a big fund in China with IDG. But that's the majority of our international businesses, and they're a small percentage of our overall businesses. I mean, as you can tell from these, you've got very traditional media businesses, some in rapid decline, for example, newspapers, and needing to reinvent themselves. Almost every one of these businesses, if they're not aggressively moving towards a digital strategy, they have to be. I mean, the mantra around the company is, you have to be moving towards digital. What are you going to do towards digital? Our TV group is probably one of the best TV groups in the world. It's 31 stations. It's the strategy they've used and the approach they've used on the technology side especially is rock solid. But for the teenage generation, they're not watching as much TV. So our TV group does well, but what's it going to do in 5 or 10 years? Our newspapers are, they go right along with all the negative comments that have made about what's going on in the newspaper industry. They have an aggressive strategy towards moving towards digital media. Magazines, again, we sold iVillage. Our magazine group used to use iVillage for their digital properties. So they created a digital media group that's doing really well. And online, from a magazine perspective, they're doing really well. Entertainment, we were one of the original investors in ESPN, so that can't go wrong. It's like an ATM machine when you think about channels. And that's sort of an overview of Hearst. So my role, and I wear many hats. I've had many CTO roles. I'm primarily going to talk about my responsibilities in the venture side, but I also have enterprise technology responsibilities, and I'll go into a little bit of that. Strategic relationships, those are mostly, that's just a fancy way of saying vendor management. So when we look at our relationship with vendors, I look at an umbrella approach to technologies across our enterprise. So I'm unbiased. I'm asked to be unbiased. I look at what could be useful for newspapers, magazines, TV, what should Hearst be doing at the broadest level. Academic relationships, so we sponsor the MIT Media Lab. I was actually just up there for the last 3 days. I've been talking for 3 days, so I can already tell my voice is at its wit's end right now, so I hope it lasts through this talk. But the Media Lab is I view it as the elevator pitch is it's a very low cost, high return R&D sponsorship. And so it's looking at 3 to 10 year out visioning of where media is going to be going. And we work with the faculty, we work with the students, and we bring in our employees. It's sort of a day, they get a day away from their daily functions, and they can think about the same way these kids are thinking about revolutionary things that could be going on in the media space. The event I was at for the last 3 days was called the Center for Future of Storytelling. So very broad. They brought in people from Hollywood, TV, advertising, transmedia folks, and really talking about and brainstorming and envisioning how is storytelling in this new world, in a highly connected, always-on digital world, how is storytelling going to change? And a large percentage of our businesses, at their broadest definition, are telling stories. News folks are telling stories, magazine writers are telling stories, whether it's with text, photos, video, or something creative. Innovation program. So internally, so if you think about our venture group and how we're dealing with the startup community or acquisitions, externally, our employees have interesting ideas for starting companies. And we wanted to create a mechanism where they could bring those ideas into a Hearst functioning unit and have them vetted and actually seeded internally. So that if you're an employee, you have an idea, it could be for your business, could be for a different business. We've had newspaper people think up ideas for broadcast TV. just web in general, or for different industries that we aren't in. So we created a mechanism so that that could occur. It's heavy workflow based. My group did the technology behind it, a social platform that people could interact with, and our employees love it. We're in, I think, our second phase of funding startup ideas. They get this normal seed amount, and they're able to create a proof of concept around their ideas. It's great for employee morale as well. Some of our businesses are sort of an accordion effect. You have traditional staffing declining and digital staffing increasing. So you want to create a mechanism where people feel like they can be a part of that future and contribute their ideas into it. And then emerging media. So I'm heavily involved in everything emerging, very involved in what's going on with today's world would be social. In the past, it was e-commerce, web, anything digital media related. And I tend to be an advocate for what we should be doing inside our traditional businesses with emerging media. So I might do a project with one of our business units to sort of figure out what they could do to move into that space. So I'm sort of on call for our various businesses in that area. As Eric mentioned, I was a corporate CTO at Time Warner a year before and a year after the AOL debacle. Anybody from AOL? AOL sponsors the Media Lab, so I actually met the AOL representative at the event. I always have to keep my point of view down because that was just a terrible merger/acquisition. It was a good job, and my entire group got let go as part of that. So I've been asked to write a book about it, which I refuse to do until I'm retired because it would be fun, and I like being employed. At Dell, that was, as Eric mentioned, that was as Dell Online was starting up. So when I started there, it was a single front-end listener with a Microsoft SQL database server, 2 servers starting, and it really wasn't a formalized e-commerce environment. So my job was to create the staff, the architecture, the infrastructure, and the process to create the e-commerce environment. And it was not to create a silo inside of Dell because Michael was just really understood that it was going to change his industry and his business. So it was to create something that you could get the entire company behind. And so if we created online capabilities, we wanted to be able to drive that into support and have them own it. We wanted to be able to drive it into IT and have them own it. And when I started there, IT really didn't want anything to do with the internet. They sort of had a very negative opinion of the internet, really because they ran all the assembly lines, and they really felt like the internet was going to put that processing that was rock solid at risk. So we had to create a good understanding of security around what was going on with e-commerce and the web, and ultimately turn it over to them. Encoda was that was a broadcast industry product and services company, and they are now part of Hearst Technologies. They were sold off to Hearst Technologies. And then other roles, primarily in either advertising, media, or technology. True North Communications is a global ad agency. I was there in the very earliest days of the web, and that was a fun job. I got to work on thousands of websites in the very earliest days. Mostly, I was sort of the lone technologist going into client meetings where account guys were doing what account guys do, and I was explaining. So I called it Internet 101, sort of explaining what the internet was and what you could do on the web. Hanna-Barbera Studios I was head of technology for animation company. My kids who are 18 and almost 21, they cried when I left Hanna-Barbera because it was such a cool place to have their dad work. They got to go to movie premieres and the cartoons they saw on Saturday they were working on. I had a very broad job there, working on traditional IT, but then also animation systems, 2D to 3D, in-betweening systems. It was really a fun, from a technologist perspective, job. So as you can tell, pretty diverse, pretty broad background, but always focusing on the technology related to the businesses. These are some of the other things I have going on. I tend to do a lot of advisory work. I'm an advisor to Mochillo, which is a media marketplace right now. I was one of the founding members of the CTO Advisory Council, and what that was a group that InfoWorld put together. It was a small group of CTOs, mostly not vendor CTOs that were driving an agenda, but sort of on the business side of being a CTO that could really look at common things that were going on from a CIO perspective. From a CTO perspective, they were different from a CIO perspective. And we ran events. I think there were, I can't recall, 4 or 5 of them. There were global events where you have 250 CTOs coming together and just sort of, the agenda was fairly broad, but talking about common best practices, common things that were going on, or something that was new. And then I advise a number of startups, including our portfolio that we have at Hearst, and I'll talk about those in a second. I've been on numerous boards. I'm currently only on the board of a bank. I've been on startup boards before for a number of years. Some of them, got blown up in the bubble. But I think as a technologist, if you can get that experience, it's useful as well. And then on the academia side, I'm a mentor at Columbia into the Masters of Technology Management practice, and that's fun. I like doing mentoring. As I mentioned, in Media Lab, we sponsor them, and then we also help hold an internal executive education program with the Kellogg School, and I coordinate the technology vertical. And so Hearst is a very long tenured company. People work there for a couple of decades. And what I found when I started there is, especially in our technology, IT engineering and digital media, maybe not digital media, but definitely IT and engineering, our folks tended to just do what they always did, and they didn't always look outside and see some of the things, agile program management, portfolio management, common ways to do, agreed to ways to do testing. They really weren't looking outside. And so I proposed, and it got approved. And so we started a tech vertical that has been well received. So we bring in outside speakers to talk to our employees. So just briefly on enterprise technology and that role. So really understanding your company when you're looking at acquiring companies is critical, because what you're going to rate the business that you're acquiring on, and it's pretty interesting that we're sitting in a Sun/Oracle building right now, because they're going to go through that fund, or in the middle of going through that fund. But as you're going through the acquisition process, as a technologist, you're trying to rate what that integration is going to be like. What are the key things that are coming from the company being acquired, and how are they going to fit into the company that you're working for? You're going to try to fill in the gaps based on that acquisition. And so in big companies, one of the challenges I've seen is when you're an enterprise-focused person, you're looking at all these, we call them divisions or units within divisions. They're focused on their core business. They're not really thinking about the whole. And so my job and my focus is to look at the whole and what can benefit the whole company, and try to be unbiased about that. I try to create a mechanism to measure our return on investment in any technology. And again, that doesn't always happen in the units. It's becoming more common, but I try to create a structure around that. So it's useful to have that happen when you get into the next area. So here's sort of the basic one-sheeter on what, as a venture group, we're pretty typical strategic venture group, what we look for. So the first bullet, I think, is key, that a simple business model that can be easily understood and explained works best. It has to be media related for us. And when I meet a startup, the first thing I say is the hardest part is not working with our venture group. It's actually being able to explain their opportunity and the problems they're going to be solving to our senior management, because our senior management is made up of mostly traditional media folks, and a lot of the newer business ideas don't resonate with them. It's not something they live with day to day. So we've been pleasantly surprised recently, because we've proposed investing in some interesting companies that they got right away. You know, it's amazing when you go into a meeting, you think it's going to be a 2-hour meeting, and it's 15 minutes. It's like, okay, go ahead and do it. So that's pretty cool. Our sweet spot tends to be a minority stake and media focus Series B startups. So from a maturity standpoint, they're probably a startup that's been around, you know, somewhere between 2.5 and 3 years in that range. Tends to be what we see. We will go earlier, we will go later. It depends on the opportunity. We rarely lead around, and the range, we have no guiding principles. This seems to be the average, 2 to 10 million over the life of the investment. Like I said, we've done way higher, we've done lower. It just depends on the opportunity. Our goals for our venture group is obviously economic returns, so we put money in, we want to get more money back. Seat at the table knowledge, especially if we're entering into a new space. And something I've been a big advocate of is entering ecosystems. So when you have a business where you're not investing in a certain ecosystem, so Twitter is a good example, or social networks, social media are good examples of an ecosystem, and Twitter being very specific. So if you want to enter into sort of the cottage industry that forms around a Twitter, and you want to invest in those sort of businesses, then when you make an investment like we did in Hootsuite, you know, you're sort of stating to that industry and to those startups that you're interested in that space, and so you get deluged with other opportunities. As with most venture-related work, you're going to meet all the competitors. You know, if folks are entering a space and raising money, you're probably going to meet all the competitors, so you sort of get to know the space. We will acquire mostly internet-based businesses that don't fit into our traditional businesses. So our group doesn't get involved in buying a new newspaper or buying a new TV station, but we do buy web businesses, and we do buy businesses that aren't part of our traditional businesses. So just quickly on the due diligence part, I have a standardized process. That's really what I'm going to go through. I act as a mentor. So once we invest in a company, I act as a mentor to that business, depending on what they need. So I will mentor their CTOs or their tech side, whatever it may be. And then we also offer networking opportunities. So we introduce those companies to, you know, our Rolodex. We introduce them into Hearst. And I'll go through a couple of businesses as examples that we invested in that are now important vendors for us at Hearst. And then, let's see. Oh, and then oversight of our wholly owned businesses. So once we acquire a business, then we get involved in the day-to-day as needed of our wholly owned businesses. So here's some examples of businesses. The top group are existing portfolio companies. So Pandora, you know, we own a few radio stations. We got rid of most of our radio stations. But Pandora has been a good investment. They're doing phenomenal right now. There was a point where it was looking a little sketchy based on the music industry in general, sort of rebelling against what Pandora was doing. But that has changed. They've reached an agreement, and now it's doing quite well, especially once they launched their iPhone app. They really took off, and probably the best thing that's happened to them recently is they got a free ad during the Super Bowl as part of the commercial that showed a whole bunch of social stuff, and Pandora was one. So we thought that was pretty cool. BuzzFeed spun out of Huffington Post, and that's a New York-based startup that we invested in, I think, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. Hootsuite was our latest investment. They're out of Vancouver. They're a social dashboard company. They really started as a dashboard for Twitter, but now they've added Facebook and LinkedIn and MySpace. Gazillion is a video game company. Movie TV is aimed at the mobile space. Our general interests tend to be traditional media, but sort of traditional media that different ways to look at where traditional media should go. Video games, mobile, and anything that's part of the food chain of what goes on in media. So Vox Pop creates web-enabled games, but real casual games, sort of multiple choice games that are really low tech but high value, and most of their customers are big media companies or big websites. Bright Cove is a video production and distribution company. Jeremy Allaire started that. That's probably a good example of a company where I don't have to do much work with their tech group. I'm part of the customer advisory board, but when Jeremy put together his business, and it became very evident when we did the due diligence on all sides, that they just had a solid management team. So I've worked with them as a customer, representing Hearst as a customer, and every group except our television group is using them as their video provider for their website. So the enterprise, strategic relationship side of me, I put that hat on, and we did an enterprise deal with Bright Cove, and so all of our businesses could leverage that. And on the other side, there's the venture side, and so I put that hat on, and then I can work with them on that side. Gather is a social network, and the news market is a video company that's aimed at producing content for broadcast TV. So they manage that. So those are current portfolio, just examples of our current portfolio. I believe we have 25 or 26 companies right now. It's on our website at the top. You can find all of them. So acquired companies, UGO is a young men's entertainment company, video games, movies, TV, gadgets. And beginning of last year, we acquired OneUp and folded them into UGO. That's a more hardcore video game web property. UGO is based in New York, OneUp's based in San Francisco, so we created that dynamic. Caboodle is a social shopping site. They're the example I use of raising a Series A. So all they had was internal funds, and I believe a little bit of angel funds, and they created the concept. And when they were going out to raise, they decided they'd rather sell. So it really fit with our what we do in women's magazines, and it fit with something we're looking to get into from a wholly owned property. And so we acquired them, and they've been doing really well. They're a good example of a startup that came into a big business and has excelled. In this corner are businesses that we have had investments in, and they've exited. So E-Ink is probably the latest one. They were sold to a Chinese company, and they're the manufacturer of the screens that go into e-readers. We announced an internally incubated company called Skiff that's our e-reader business. And they originally started based on our involvement with E-Ink, but they're really an e-reader distribution platform aimed at the publishing industry. Sphere was sold to AOL. They're a blogging-related company for related content. Broadcast.com was Mark Cuban's company. That was early in the day before I was there. Same with Netscape. So there's a history of investment with some pretty interesting companies. Sling Media, I'm sure you know who they are, but we had a good investment in them. They exited pretty early just because the opportunity came up for them to exit. And then XM. And XM is a good example of a company that's directly competitive to our core traditional businesses. So we're entering into that space because we want that economic return, but we also want that seat at the table and key learnings from what's going on with them. And I mentioned iVillage. I'm going to go into some of the venture-related stuff. Are there any questions on any of our businesses?
What sort of percentage are you taking in some of these companies, and how much valuation are you associating, and how did some of the deals happen? Like, are people just cold calling, pitching you, or are you leading some of these, or do you have a special group of people?
So I can't talk about valuations.
A percentage of the company then?
Yeah, percentage, it's minority stake. So I think
1 or 5?
We own up to 50% in some businesses. We tend to be lower than 10. And as all things, in the venture world work, the further out the raise, each round goes, the more cramped down you get. The way startups come into us, primarily banks. Once a startup gets a bank that represents them, and they come in through that mechanism. I'm very involved in the online and social community, so I tend to get very early stage startups coming. I do things like this, so they come that way. And a lot of it's networking. I mean, knowing a lot of entrepreneurs, other VCs. There are times when a startup wants a strategic. There's a good reason to have a strategic compared to a traditional VC. And it depends on where they're at, what sort of business they are, and where they're at in the maturity, whether they're going to go that way. Sometimes it's just to have the meeting with the strategic to get that feedback, and they may not really want that investment, but they sort of want the strategic view of that versus the traditional VC. We're going to look at, I don't want to paint a negative picture of traditional VC versus strategic, but they play different roles in the ecosystem that is venture. But those are most of the ways.
You mentioned all companies except local.com.
Local we had an interest in because of our involvement with newspapers and the changes that are going on in there. That was economic return when we made the investment, and it was also trying to learn what could be done in that space, but it wasn't that. They're pretty edgy.
How often do you guys invest in later rounds to keep your diligence conclusion?
Later rounds are tough because the valuation gets so high, and we're a private company. We will participate in some of the big events that you've all read about, especially the big acquisitions that are out there that other media companies get involved in, but we tend not to overpay. And so the same thing goes on the investment side. We tend not to want to pay related to the value, the extreme valuation that's out there. So they don't happen too often.
So how many investments did you make, for example, last year?
We don't measure ourselves that way, but
I'm just,
it's on our, you can look at it on our website. I think we average probably exits are a couple a year and maybe 4 or 5 a year. So,
Do some of these deals also get initiated on the content side of Hearst, or is it initiated purely from the directive?
we haven't done it on the content side, but our magazine group has done it. They bought Real Age a couple of years ago. They did that for a reason. They brought, what's it called, eCrush. There's a few where they're trying to fill a gap. We have an investment in our TV division in Internet Broadcast Systems, and that was an investment that was more of an operational investment. So invest in the business that then ends up doing all their web properties for them. So we do have some of those occurring.
What sort of metrics can people use to measure the value of interactivity or social engagement when it comes to some of your properties? As a traditional person, obviously, you use metrics for distribution and then impressions models.
Yep.
And as media has become more interactive, what value is gained by the amount of interactivity that people use either on blogs or web properties that you have, or social interaction that they have with other friends and things
I have
like
no
that?
idea how to answer that question. Maybe I don't understand the question. I can talk about the analytics we use. We have a huge enterprise deal with Omniture, and we try to measure ourselves across all our properties and compare notes. But other than that, I probably don't understand your question. Do you want to rephrase it?
Okay, so previously with just newspapers, people used
Oh, you mean like circulation versus...
physical distribution and impressions, right? And as Google came out, they popularized click-throughs for ads. Now, as media has become more interactive, people have been fighting for time and eyeball space. But certainly there's some value to be had by people's engagement with a particular blog, or the fact that someone's friends recommend something. Social engagement has a stickiness to it for a property, as opposed to just the fact that they spend 2 hours on Facebook, as opposed to the fact that they tend to get recommendations from people that they know. How do people value that metric? The stickiness of people's ability to interact with a property, as opposed to simply spending a certain amount of time passively reading something.
Yeah. So, from our side, we're just like any other web property. We're looking at, traffic, ad revenue. We do some sponsorships. We do, we have good brands already for the most part. So in our magazine group, for example, those are very well-known brands. We're trying not to undervalue the digital media side in our ad deals. We have a huge drive towards community building around all our properties. We just think that's highly beneficial, that it's not just repeat visitors, but it's actually an active community around a brand. So a good example is One Up, our video game property. Most of their traffic is community based. We just relaunched UGO on a new CMS, and I think the highest drivers are Facebook and then Twitter right after that. So, we're looking at that, and one of the things we do, and part of my job is to share that experience across the other groups. I hope that answers it. So, that's a deep question. Any more, or should I go to the next? Yeah, go ahead.
Besides something being very profitable, why else do you buy properties?
Besides what?
Besides something being very profitable, why else would you buy something?
Yeah, it's economic return, seat at the table, so you get involved with the company, so you learn about that space and get that experience of being involved with the management team and understand that space, especially if it's a new space. So XM is a good example of understanding what's going on with satellite radio and satellite distribution compared to our traditional businesses, and then entering a new industry, or I call it a new ecosystem, but getting involved in that again to learn about it and get more exposure into that. But at the end of the day, you don't want to lose money. I mean, you're not doing it as a loss leader, so you do want to at least get your money back, which we don't publicly talk about it, but if we measured ourselves, and I'm publicly talking about it right now, so I'll be very vague, but if we measured ourselves against traditional VCs, we would be highly rated in that regard. So we're not as risky, I think, as some traditional VCs, a little more predictable.
So for the companies that you're considering acquiring, what type of revenue markers are you looking at? Or what's the thought process that you engage in when you're saying, okay, this has got a lot of upside potential here, but they're coming in at this revenue? Is there a certain kind of frame that you're looking at?
We won't buy pre-revenue businesses, and we want a business where we can predict out that there'll be at least a $50 million business, a certain amount of time frame with a certain amount of investment or work.
7 years, 5 to 7?
Probably less than 5. That's where, but it's vague. I mean, it depends on the opportunity and where they sit. There aren't that, even though everybody talks about acquisition, to really get it to that, there aren't that many. So just some general, I'm going to talk about technology and products, but just for the entrepreneurs in the room, and just some general examples, and I put up some links towards the end, which is good things to follow and read. But really, when you're first starting out, really seek out advisors and angels that are entrepreneurs that have already built businesses and have exited, or have, they may have become angels after a successful exit, and then they get involved in the VC side. I just think that, if you're going to have advisors who are traditional VCs that haven't been involved in taking a business from concept to exit, they're not going to, personally, it's an overgeneralization, but they're not going to add as much value as those that have done it, because building a business is tough. Raising money is, a lot of times it's talked about as a 3-month process. I think in our experience, from start to finish, when you need to raise money, it's more like a 6 to 9 month process from when you start and say we're going to raise money to when you get money in the bank. And the CEO will be focused anywhere from 50 to 90% of their time doing that. And to some entrepreneurs, that's a huge pain, because that CEO is most likely one of the founders. They've most likely had the concept of what to do, and they're adding to marketing or technology, depending on what type of business it is. So just once you undertake that, it's a huge undertaking. I get asked about NDAs all the time. VCs don't sign NDAs. We tend to meet, and I've never met a VC that says, "Oh, I sign every NDA I'm given." And there's a basic concept behind it. If you're meeting with one company in a space, you're probably going to meet with every competitor in the space. NDAs put you into a weird legal situation where, something's going to come up or something down the line where the startup will view that this big company came in and stole our ideas. It just doesn't happen. So it's big companies are big companies. They're not as flexible and nimble as a startup. So it'd be very hard to take a startup idea and create that inside of a big company. And so NDAs just don't enter into it. I've seen NDAs signed late in the process when you're going to expose something that is viewed as, and you're going to do the deal. You're just working out the fine elements of it. And I have seen some NDAs signed very late in the process, but it's extremely rare. Yep.
Just on that point, if that is the case, if they don't sign the NDAs, how do you suggest a small company protect itself from potential investors that might be interested in stealing your ideas or getting a ramp up in that field?
So you talk up to what you're comfortable and then you stop. It's real simple. Don't expose something that you view as your intellectual property that you think somebody may take or a competitor may take. It's a gut check sort of approach, but that's what I always recommend when somebody says, I'll only talk to you if you sign this NDA. And this doesn't just happen on the venture side. It happens maybe with a vendor, and I'm not ready to sign an NDA with them for whatever reason. Then I just tell them, talk up to where you're comfortable and don't stop. And if you can't get your point across up to that point, then wait 6 months and have a conversation later. The company plans, just a real good rule of thumb, have a plan that's stage appropriate, so you're angel level, Series A, B, C, whatever, and this is a general rule, but try to do it in 18-month views. So we're going to be at this point in 18 months, we're going to be at this point in the next 18 months, and be able to state that as you explain your plan. Ensure that your staff is committed to your vision. The first element I'm going to talk about is staffing, and it's the most critical part of the conversation with any business, whether you're investing in it or acquiring it. And then that vision's going to change because every startup that I've seen and we've invested in, their business changes a few times. I referenced Brightcode is a very good investment for us. They've changed their business model. They've tweaked it a number of times since our original investment. It's still in the same basic space, but they've definitely changed where the revenue is coming from and where they focus on it. There was one point when they were really trying to become a YouTube, and that just wasn't necessary. There already was a YouTube. So they focused on a different aspect of that space. Ambiguity. There's ambiguity in every whether you're a big business or a small business, but in startups, it's just the norm, and just embrace flexibility. Every startup I've met, their ability to be flexible is much better than a big company. And then clearly stating what gap your product or service is going to address. What's the problem you're going to solve? Too often we see businesses come in where they say, here's our solution, here's our product, it does X, but they can't articulate what that problem is and the gap in the market that they're going to address. And don't realize there will be competitors. You're not going to be the first one in the space, and that you want to be able to address those, how you are different from those competitors. So that's just a few of my points from an entrepreneurial side. Any questions, or should I move into the tech stuff? Yeah.
You say 6 to 9 months from the start to when you have the money in the bank. Is that for Series A, Series B, seed stage?
It's I think Angel is usually pretty quick. That's quicker, but definitely, well, that would be for a B, and it would probably be pretty similar for all of them. It's really, in today's market especially, it's also different regionally. So I think if you're in Canada, I have a lot of VC friends in Canada and entrepreneurs in Canada. We invested in a Vancouver-based company. That one was definitely a 6-month duration. And it's really, as an entrepreneur, you're going to look at what your funding needs are and really be able to plan that you're going to have to dedicate a good chunk of your time to getting that. So, yeah.
When you say 6 to 9 months from the time you start speaking to the VC, start the due diligence process, start what?
Yeah, you create your plan of the funding you're going to need. Make sure you have enough funding for, that 6 to 9 months out that it's going to take.
But once you start engaging in discussions, how
it's
long
going
should
to
it
be
take?
probably 6 to 9 months. Yeah. Starting when you take your first meeting either with a bank, or directly with a VC, it's probably going to be 6 to 9 months. And this is a general rule, but just from the folks I've talked to, it seems to be the norm. Yeah. Did you have a question? No? Yeah, you.
How formal do you usually see are startups putting together formal advisory boards, and are those advisory boards usually compensated with equity?
It's usually with options, and the ones that are formal. Some are just mentoring and informal, but I've been a part of numerous formal advisory boards. They act just like a regular board. Sometimes I've been involved in some where I'm on the tech advisory board and there's a sales advisory board. A lot of it's networking and just sort of being able to bounce ideas off folks that are external. You don't serve the same function as a director, but I think the more mature your startup gets, the more you want a formalized advisory board. It helps in your presentation. Hey, we have these people involved, they're not directors, but they're helping us, especially if they're from the space that you're entering into.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Okay, I'll go. How often are you seeing, there's a big movement, obviously, in web properties and agile adaptive and these kinds of things, and there's a lot of people who sound the death knell for the classic business plan. So how much do you hold entrepreneurs' feet to the fire around the business plan, if you will? Is it classic, or is it more something, a new kind of, is it PowerPoint now?
It varies. Every first meeting is a PowerPoint. For angels, it's usually a one-page, sort of a vision statement almost of, this is the space we're going to go into, and are you interested? And most angels, it's very specific to their areas of interest. But it's it starts with a PowerPoint, and then the business plan. I don't get those formalized business plans. Don't cross my desk. We have analysts that do that. And the tech process I'm going to talk about creates the tech due diligence document that goes along with the packet that ends up going in front of basically our CEO and our president to recommend whether we invest or acquire or whatever. So, but I haven't seen the old school traditional 90-page business plan in quite a while. So, yep, I think you would.
Can you speak about the process of approaching a bank or a startup?
So that's interesting because I'm on the board of a bank, so I can sort of talk about it from that side. But I think it's the same way. You have to do your research on VCs that are interested in what your company is going to be producing, and the same way around banks. You should ask your peers. So go to startup networking events on banks they've worked with and their experience. Same thing with VCs. I think on that side, but no, I'm not an expert in how to approach a bank. They definitely are the ones that give us the highest percentages of companies that we take a look at, just in general, and they seem to be more buttoned up as far as the packet that you look at, their preparedness for talking to VCs.
So in your experience, you've seen a lot of startup companies, management teams, some good, I'm sure some bad.
Yep.
If you can talk a bit about the transition, or maybe some pitfalls to avoid from the time you're assembling your management team to take that to your financing, are there certain things that we can avoid in terms of putting together teams that might avoid problems when it comes time to an acquiring company stepping in? Things from an equity perspective, perhaps, or any kind of arrangement that you've seen that has created problems when investors step in and say, oh, we have to clean this up now. Is there anything that we can do to avoid that? Or
I haven't seen that many problem areas. I mean, we definitely have a number of scenarios. We've had some scenarios with acquired companies where we've had founders that stayed for a little while and then they ended up exiting. Some were clean, some were messy, it's just the nature of the beast. We tend to, in most of our investments, we tend to take a board seat, or if we're a very small percentage, an advisor seat. You know, once you're involved, a ton of time at a board level deals with just overall staffing, you know, management level staffing. I'll talk about the fundamentals of the tech side of staffing in a little bit, but I don't think there's any general rule of thumb on what to avoid. Just hire smart people and communicate with them properly and make sure they're on board with the vision. So, how are we doing on time?
We're okay. I don't know how many slides you got left.
I'm about halfway through, I guess.
I would say let's hold the Q&A to the Q&A at the session at the end, which will give a chance for pretty much everyone to get their questions, and if that's okay.
Sure. I mean, I think if we'll see. You know, this stuff could go really quick because it's pretty mundane stuff.
We'll play it by ear.
Yeah. So just a general overview of the tech due diligence side. A lot of VCs hire consultants to do this because we're strategic. And you know, I was hired to be able to do this and the other enterprise things that I do. So I will do most of our due diligence, or I'll hire a consultant to work with me if it's in a more stretched out process. If we're going to acquire somebody and I want to hire an expert to work with me on it. But it's really the fundamentals of the technology side is what I focus on. And again, it's to start a conversation. So it's structured questions, structured answers, and it's not it's not a scenario where I'm expecting a startup to have very formalized documentation on everything they're doing, but I want them to be able to articulate it. Sometimes it's the first time they're doing it, to really articulate what they're doing, and then create the conversation around that. So it's really just to be able to have the startup be able to clearly articulate what they've created. I really look for landmines. So I've met some folks where their day job is a .NET developer, and sure enough, their startup is all developed in .NET. And if .NET is the right tool for that product, then that's great. But if they're doing it because that's what they know, that may not be the right decision. And so I'm gonna look into that. I send out the document, I ask for written answers back, and then I set up usually a call or a meeting. If they're local, it'll be a meeting where we can go through the process. So I'll use Hootsuite as a good example. So Hootsuite, I sent them the document. They were made up mostly of developers. So their entire company was mostly developers. So when I did the call with them, I didn't just have the CTO in the room. Every employee was in the room because they were all tech-based, and each one had their own special area. And so different folks answered different parts of the document, and they actually did a pretty good job. I really liked their approach. They didn't waste any money on infrastructure. They do everything through Amazon Compute and Storage. They do all their testing through that. They didn't waste any of their costs. Oh, thanks. You can tell my voice is going. Didn't waste any of their focus on the low-level part of the technology stack. They were just working on iterating and creating that dashboard that their customers wanted. And like I said, for some companies, especially if we're doing an acquisition, I'll look for somebody that's regional, that comes from that space that I can hire as a consultant to work with me, and they'll follow my lead. But they'll spend every day working with the company and produce documentation back that then we can walk through and work on, and then that just becomes part of the report. So the staffing, I think this is the most important part of every discussion, whether it's the business, sales, technology, legal, whatever, and it's having confidence in the people. When you're investing in a company, you're investing in the people. You have to believe in the product ideas and everything else, But if you don't believe in the people, you shouldn't make that investment or do that acquisition, because that's the strength of the business. So these are sort of the fundamentals. I have them break down every full-time equivalent employee they have, what their roles are, so a lot of times this gets left off. They'll have 4 full-time employees, but 18 freelancers, contract people, and outsourced services. And I actually want to know all those, because I want to know the exact how many people are working against what they're producing, and the cost structure around all of it. I don't get into detailed salary information for investments, only for acquisitions. And for acquisitions, you sort of want to see you want to see a 3-year history of what's occurred there. And, same thing around the contracted cost. The final bullet, I think, is really key, because you'll see the current footprint of the company around their staffing, but you really want to know where their gaps are. If they get this funding, are they going to use this money to hire 6 new developers? And what are those developers going to be focused on? So that's left off a lot of times, and that's key. A lot of startups just sort of organically go at the hamster wheel of, we've got to do this, we've got to do this. And you really need that view of, with these resources, we can do X today, but if we had this funding and we added these 3 resources, we could do Y tomorrow, and here's our roadmap of what we want to be able to do. Any questions on staffing? Good. Infrastructure, architecture, and product. I group all these together, the various layers of the stack. In today's world, for startups, infrastructure is very straightforward. I'm looking for the lowest cost, highest performing equation to what they're producing. I definitely don't like seeing a startup that has a closet full of servers that's managed in their building with a T1 connection going into it. They're very low cost, high performing solutions, whether it's a cloud-based company or a colo or a managed care provider. But it's the most mundane part of the stack that no startup should be investing any time or effort in today's world. And frankly, any big business should be looking at that as well. So I do a lot of talking about cloud and virtualization inside our business as well. So the second bullet is usually non-existent in a startup, but it's a good exercise to go through and document what you have in place, especially the architectural side of your product. And so I've had numerous startups that after they go through the process, even if we don't fund them, they like going through that exercise because now they have something they can use with anybody else they go to, and it actually helps them with their internal management team because they were forced to take the time to document and write things down. Any of you that have a developer background, you know that documentation just tends to wait till you absolutely need to do it, and it's just in time. Yeah, exactly. Again, so the data center side, I look for a complete breakdown of what they're doing, and again, this isn't hard and fast. For someone like I said, like Hootsuite, they gave us all the details on what they're doing with Amazon. It's pretty straightforward. For acquisition, I'm going to look at a lot of detail around the contracts, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Disaster recovery and business continuity, those are things that big companies tend to focus on and startups never focus on. However, in today's world, you can get very rudimentary, at least DR capabilities from the cloud, very low cost, and as you scale, you can just leverage that environment. So any startup I meet with, if they're not thinking about it, I always ask them to think about it. Are you going to be able to do this? Is your architecture structured in such a way that you can recreate it if something goes on with your existing, your initial instance of what you do? Then I get into having them expose everything they're doing from a development staging and production environment. Now this is hardware, but I don't want to spend too much time on the hardware. I just want a list of what they're doing. If it's virtualized, I want a list of how they're doing that. If it's something they own, I actually want to see full specs, especially if it's an acquisition, because those are assets, you don't understand what they're doing. A lot of times, if we do an acquisition, we're going to end of life what they do and bring them into our, Hearst-based contracts, because we have some pretty good capabilities, and so we're going to devalue what's coming from the company we're acquiring, and we're going to figure out what it's going to take to move them into our current platforms. Software, what they're doing from that perspective. And then the last one, again, this is an area where most startups don't focus on this, but really having a CTO and their team define the methodology that they take around scalability, for example. So have they built an environment that's good for the next 18 months? Have they overbuilt? I've definitely seen some startups that invest way too much in their initial scalability and not enough in keeping those costs down and having a flexible architecture that they can extend as they grow. And then how they deal with the emerging technology side is really about, you create a business idea, you have a concept around a product, you have services that you're going to use to deploy it, and then something new comes about. How do you deal with that? The one that I always see is just you have a business that produces an API and they decide to change their API. This happens around the cottage industry. It's around Twitter all the time or Facebook. And you have a really good business idea, that pipe changes, that API changes, and it derails your business model. We don't tend to look at business models that are going to be that fragile. So being able to understand that. Software platforms, applications, all of those. Again, some of these are so specific and really aimed at a more mature company, but I actually want to have them do the exercise of being able to define what they're doing in these sort of parameters. It's a really good exercise. It helps them, figure out what they're doing. And some startups I've met with don't even realize that they've created a platform. They think they've just created a business, but they've created an extensible platform. And as they go through the exercise of documenting it, it's someone like me that points out that, hey, you have a leverageable engine there, and if your business goes in that direction, you're structured in a way where you can leverage that. Patents always come up. It's one of those areas that, nice if you have it, not something to spend a whole bunch of time on, especially in today's world. Tech companies tend to focus more on acquiring patents than a media company would. If they're there, that's great, but we're not one of those businesses that's going to bump up the valuation of time because there's a number of patents that we want to go out and defend. It's just not the nature. And then analytics, gets to, I think, a little bit of your question, but in any business, what are the analytics that you're going to use to judge that business and how it does? How are you performing analytics? If it's a web-based business, is it in a structured way? Is it something that can be shared with us? Those are sort of the lowest level of the tech stack. Then you get into sort of how does the business function, and workflow and processes. Those are really scary words to a startup. And most startups I meet with, don't have a clue how they do things. As they go through the process, they can explain it. It depends on their background. Some people have a really solid background and they've already thought through that. But it's really trying to break down how do you deal with change management? How do you deal with versioning as you put out new versions of your product? How do you work with the overall UX experience of what you're doing? And are you structured in such a way that you can leverage that? And I'm not going to read through every one of these, but they're all sort of basic fundamentals that I'm going to look for the business to define. And again, they may not answer every question, and I'm not going to give them a negative mark. If they don't, I want them to try to take their business and their product and fit it into these questions if they can, and then that starts the conversation. Budgets and planning, that's just critical to see what's your run rate today, it's a tech-based company, most of the staffing is going to be applied against that. So I'm going to want to see a documented plan. And again, going through the funding process, maybe the first time the tech side does that. And the documenting the plan is great, but documenting the roadmap is critical, because if we're making an investment or we're doing an acquisition, we actually want to know where is this going from today forward. How is this funding money going to be used against their core product, and really document what do we think we're going to do 6, 12, 18 months out. And I've had a number of businesses that they haven't even thought that far, and going through this exercise is really helpful for them. How things are prioritized. There's, in big businesses sometimes it's there's a very formal process for how priorities are set against new initiatives, and in smaller businesses there isn't. It's if you have the ear of the CEO and you decide you're going to move your ship a little bit in that direction, that's how it occurs. I actually want to go through the exercise of understanding, how that is working, and is that manageable, or will you be diverging too much and not staying on a planned course. List of contracts. These are mostly critical when we do an acquisition. We do them with investments as well, and sometimes it's as a company becomes part of our portfolio, there are certain deals that we've done as Hearst that we can give those benefits to our portfolio companies. So Dell is a good example. We have a great deal with Dell. You can probably guess where the background is, but we're able to give that buying at a Hearst level purchasing rate to our startups. They can be under 50% of ownership. Some of our vendors, you have to be 50% or more to do it, so that helps on that side. So this is a summary. Just my recommendation is be prepared to have the conversation regarding the technology and product decisions that you make and your desires. So the desire side is real critical. What are you doing today, but what would you like to do? What would you do if you had this money? Creating a structured story that's easy to explain, just really critical. I'm a technology agnostic. I recommend to all my fellow technologists to become an agnostic. Don't be, religious. Go down a religious path. Really pick the right tool for the solution you're trying to solve. It will resonate better as you're out talking to folks, especially if you're raising money. The ask what an entity that funds or acquires us will think of these decisions. That's really when you know you're going to be raising money. If you're looking at, I have a decision today, is this something that I'm doing it because I have a personal preference, or if I really made a logical decision, I'm not wasting money, I'm spending it on the right things, I'm spending it on intellectual property and core product and not sort of the commoditized part of the technology stack. It's just a good question to always ask. And then, like I said, this creates a conversation around this. These are some links. You'll have this deck, so you can either take a photo of that, or my recommendation, there's Venture Maven is a list of probably every VC that's on Twitter. Really good list. Really good way to start engaging with angels, VCs, and Tom's link, the one that's at the bottom. One of the things he has a huge post on what he says about the fundraising process. And one of the things he said is, even before you, and he's a CEO that we've talked to. He's a CEO of GIST, G-I-S-T, and he just basically said, start to engage with the venture and angel community even before you know you're going to need to start raising money. Form relationships with social tools now. You can do that. Some are better at engaging than others. Good blogs to read are Brad's and Fred's. I know Brad personally. I don't know Fred, but I read his blog. I think he writes a good blog on the space. And then there's some good focused websites. Read Write Web has a good startup vertical that they're focused on, Alley Insider does. And then out of Toronto, Globe and Mail, Mark Evans writes a really good startup column. That he focuses on. And then there's the way to get to me. This entire due diligence document is on a wiki. You can join it and participate in it. You can change it. If you see things that you think should be done a different way or expand it, go ahead and do that. I open sourced it a few years ago. And there's either my personal email or my work email. Either one's fine. And online on social sites, I'm WeMac. That's the way you can always find me. I mostly put stuff on Flickr, but I do a lot of other junk too. Any questions?
Wait, before we do questions, pause one moment. First, for the people who came in a little later, this is our fantastic speaker, Mike Dunn. He is the CTO of Hearst Interactive Media, former CTO of Time Warner, and the founding CTO of Dell's Online division. Earlier, for those who came a little bit late, but not as late, we had our wonderful lightning talk by Carl Pachata, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships for Schooner Information Technology. They produce hardware.
Memcached and MySQL appliances.
Thank you. Hardware appliances specifically for Memcached and for MySQL. They have given us an iPad which will be raffled off. Everyone will get that. It's a 32 gigabyte iPad, which is the higher up one. It will be raffled off. Everyone will get that in their email. And if anyone who sat in the first handful of rows won some books, anyone won? I don't know if everyone scratched them off yet. Well, there was some books from 101 Free Tech Books. If anyone's, I know there's someone at least who's got an instant winner in there. If anyone's got the instant winner, feel free to stand up and shout. I also want to thank Sun Microsystems, which is now Oracle Sun Microsystems, for their continued support, as well as our sponsors, HP iPack, Dunlop Sport, Microsoft's Online Business Productivity Suite, Vork, the high-performance framework for PHP, and I think that might be all of them. Okay. Now, if the slides will be online. Everyone's going to get that in an email, so for those who can't see the links or weren't able to photograph them, as I saw some people do, you will get them. They will be posted up, and the link to that will be distributed. And if anyone wants to do questions, now's the time. Wow, that guy went quick, man.
Okay. Let's say that you go through the due diligence process that you just outlined for us, and you discover a company that has great technologists, a room full of super programmers. They've developed a product that you like, but they have no workflow and processes.
Well, that doesn't matter.
That doesn't matter. Okay, but how would you?
I want them to think about it and try to document it. I've gotten back. Some people are good writers, and some people, write a sentence or two, and then it comes out in the verbal side. When we do the conversation. So if they have it, I want to know about it. But if they haven't formalized it, it's okay. I may ask questions about that, because there's always a process to how you do things. You decide to add new functionality to a website you've created. There's some way that you figure out that that's what you should do next. So I sort of want to understand that. I just don't want to see chaos.
Okay, but would you introduce workflow and processes into the mix, or just let them keep coding away?
For an investment, no. I personally wouldn't introduce it. I'd say you ought to think about a formalized way to do things, because it just helps as you move forward. We do that. I mean, there's some folks from some of our businesses here. We do those in all of our businesses. Try to create structure without being onerous. Yeah.
All the way over there.
For investment, how important is geographical proximity?
So that's a good question. So we invested in a Chinese-based video game company. We have not invested in any European-based companies that I'm aware of. We've seen a few. A lot of times it's mostly domestic companies. We invested in a Canadian company. We have investments all over the place. It's not just New York-based or New England-based.
The Europeans, they weren't good, or you didn't invest in them because they were in Europe?
I haven't seen a ton that, fit in what we're looking for. I don't, definitely in the mobile space, there's a lot of interesting things going on in Europe. So we may see things in those areas. Depends on if they're focused in, we're mostly a domestic-based company. So there are, like, Zamanta is a good company that, it came out of Europe. A couple of their executives moved to New York, and they're representing themselves here in New York, but they're a European-based semantic technology-based company, and I've been talking to them for over a year, and they're a pretty interesting company, but we don't have an investment in them yet.
Right there.
Would you ever buy a profitable tech company with no full-time staff that just relies on freelancers? What do you think of those kinds of companies?
For those who didn't hear the question, do you really need to have staff to be acquired?
I don't know. Depends on the business. I mean, there's got to be some staff. Not in my watch, no. But I do like to see, the staff focused on the core product and all the commodity stuff, especially for early stage startup done by bigger expert groups that can do it. So you could think of those as outsourced or freelancers. Just economically, it just makes sense. But that ratio of high degree of freelancers, I haven't seen any that I would invest in. But if you have an idea, let me know.
Yes.
Mike, you said you pick up 3 or 4 properties a year. How many actually cross your desk?
So I don't see all of them. Our analysts probably, I don't know, they get a few a day, I guess. I probably, on the due diligence side, I probably do a couple a month. Or just, informal first meetings. But yeah, the ratio of folks, it's never slacked off, even during the economic side. There's always, startups. And there aren't many strategic VCs left, so we are, especially in the media space, we are, of interest to those if they want a strategic.
Yes. What I'm seeing in my everyday life, lots more virtual workforces, spread out.
Is that what you meant? Virtual workforce? Okay.
Not part-time, full-time, they're not all co-op. So does that affect your decision? I'm curious.
Oh, you mean location-wise? A developing team in Australia? I personally don't care. That in today's world, you have tools so you can make that work. Some folks do, but for me, I've seen businesses that function very well. Is that what you meant? People that are all over?
In this day and age, you could have some business guy with no technical knowledge just hire a bunch of freelancers, make a very profitable business.
I'm not talking about freelancers.
Yeah, you're talking about something different, but I get both of them. I think it depends on the business.
Right there, yeah.
I guess since this is a MySQL meetup,
Yeah.
how does MySQL fit within Hearst, in terms of for mission critical functions, or do you rely on bigger sort of iron?
So Hearst in general, we have a little bit of everything. Our bigger content management systems are open source based systems. Database behind it, John, is what? MySQL. So there you go. So that's running most of our big websites. We have some Oracle. We have some DB2. We're a big media company. We have a little bit of everything. Most portfolios, startups, early stage startups that I see are LAMP based. It just seems to be the most straightforward. Matt?
Yeah. Well, under what circumstances might use of open source? Obviously, a lot of the companies are using it for OS and database. Have you ever invested in a company that's product itself was open source, and would it ever, under what circumstances might it raise a red flag?
I'm trying to think, just not at Hearst, but probably over the various startups I've worked with over my career. There's definitely been a few where open source made sense. They were in the tech space. I think there was one that was a video-based company years ago called Emotion, I think that was it, that went that way. It depends on the size of the company, how big it's going to get. If you assume that we're going to look at companies that we want to get to about a $50 million maturity level, that, I don't know, what did MySQL sell for?
More than that.
But it'd be rare, I think.
I want to pick up on one of the points that you touched on earlier. One of the big parts of my business is actually providing IT support, tech support to early stage startups. What we generally find is that being flexible is not the problem. We're dealing with a lot of very creative individuals who see possibilities everywhere. What do you see as some of the best techniques in helping them stay focused on the most valuable, most leveraged opportunities?
I don't know if you're here for the part where I said that they've got to prove that they're solving a problem. So, heavy tech-focused businesses, some of the ones I've seen, they're very enamored with the technology they're creating and the solution, but when we look at it, and myself even as a technologist, I may be enamored with the technology, but I don't see the problem it's solving. And so always trying to bring it back to how are you doing with your customers, what is your product or service doing to serve some advantage to that customer base, and not as much, this sounds terrible coming from a technologist, but not as much focus on, the sexiness of the technology, but what problem are you trying to solve? And I am seeing a number of companies that are aiming at the startup space. There's a group of MBA kids that came out of Sloan that are set up, they created a startup and they realized that there weren't a lot of advisory services for startups, so they morphed their startup into a service entity for early stage startups and just tell them how to structure what they're doing, come up with, like Jim asked about the basic business plan versus a 90-page business plan, the basic way to approach the market. So more and more service-based entities around the startup field.
What is the name of that company that you just mentioned?
I can't remember. The one that came out of Sloan?
Yes.
Yeah, I can't remember what they named it. If you send me an email, I'll look it up. I spoke at Sloan years ago, and they were in the audience. They were second-year MBA students, and I formed a relationship with them. And, they started this company. I think it's a good idea.
So what's your perception of the serial entrepreneur? So if this new company comes across your desk and through your due diligence process, you find that the principals are in a couple of different companies. Does that affect your decision-making in terms of you view their commitment as maybe being obviously less than 100%? Is that a parallel entrepreneur?
Well, so, the moral of the story is what was the story? What did they have success? So Jeremy Allaire, created a business, sold it, exited, and then created Brightcove. So he was a very successful serial entrepreneur. And then there were other entrepreneurs that, created a startup, took funding, and there was an end of life there that wasn't a successful exit. So we will look at that as well. But it's always, the historical side of it.
During the 6 to 9 month due diligence period that you described earlier, how interactive is the communication? Are you just looking at things and just it takes a long time to go through? Does the entrepreneur continually feed you additional information about the company as it goes along?
Well, so maybe I wasn't clear. I don't think it's 6 to 9 months with one group of VCs. There's definitely you're trolling for fish in the early part, finding a bank, finding relevant VCs, getting those that are interested in, sort of setting up the structure. There's some startups that we rarely lead. So there's some startups that we're interested in, but we won't lead. They don't have a lead yet. So they spend, a month or two out finding the right lead that would, wants to be involved with the strategic and, likes that mix. The actual internal process, once we say, we want to write this up and we want to go to bat for funding this business, actually from the VCs and strategic VC groups I've worked with, our group is real quick. Our legal process, all the processing we do, we just basically have to get two people's approval, the president of the group and then the CEO of the little company. So that process is pretty quick. The other thing we pride ourselves in is, I just call it the yes, no, maybe answer. We're pretty good at that first pitch. Yes, this looks interesting. Let's keep going with this. No, this doesn't fit our, what we're looking for, or maybe, ask more questions.
So you made the pitch. The VCs expresses some interest. They have the business plan. They're going through the financials. You have some level of interaction and communication. How long does it take to go to the yes, no, to get to the CEO for the yes, no? That's what I'm wondering.
No, I meant us. So we do yes, no, maybe real quick. Our group, whether it's me on the tech side or the analysts on the pure venture side. That 6 to 9 months is sort of it's just a good rule of thumb. I've heard it from numerous, CEOs or entrepreneurs that don't assume it's going to be, to go out and raise money is going to be a really quick process, because it just isn't. It's very onerous and time consuming. Does that help?
Yes.
Not completely, but because you didn't say that, like the yes, you just said it's real quick for you, but I want to know
For me,
how
so
long
yes,
it's real
no,
quick.
maybe is that first meeting.
Okay.
So I know on my side if if something fits in our realm or doesn't, and so I can usually give that answer pretty quick.
We only have time for a handful more questions, so the gentleman with the tie.
Hey, thanks. There are only a couple of possible liquidity events for any startup, right? An IPO or a sale, and often a sale is going to be to a strategic. So when you talk about how Hearst doesn't lead, I assume, or I guess I'm asking, is one of the reasons why you don't is to sort of blunt the criticism that, well, when it comes time to sell this company, and we're in your space, which is why you're looking at us, we want to have a competitive auction. We don't want you to have veto provisions on the sale of the company.
Yeah.
Seat on the board. I mean, how do you address that concern for people when you're proposing Hearst as an investor?
We're a small group, and I think just your ability to be the lead investor and then the lead VC on the board, we're just spread too thin. So that's why we tend not to lead. There's also a risk level there, so we tend to not want to be that lead investor. Our internal SCIF, the e-reader company that we incubated internally, we are the lead investor because it came all on our dime to create it. So there are times when we will do it. But yeah, there's less analytics around it compared to normal VCs, I think.
Yes. You're vetting technology for the company, and then you're vetting technology for financial investments. What happens, or does it happen, that someone internally says, we don't want to use your product, we want open source, so we don't want to use Brightcode, we want to use Kaltura?
Yeah, that happens. Like I said, our TV group doesn't use, I think I said it, but our TV group doesn't use Brightcode. We're the only group that doesn't. They went down a Flow framework, which is an open source framework. It's IBS that does it. So yeah, we don't strong arm them. We'd like to think that our portfolio company, like a Brightcode, if they're in that space, that they have a seat at the table to pitch, and then we'd like to hear why they didn't win the business, but that's more, giving them feedback on why it occurred. We want that vendor, that if it's a vendor, where Brightcode is the vendor, we want them to succeed on their own merits. We have an investment in them. I will get questions on, well, if we have an investment in them, why can't we get their product for free? And the venture side, of course, we don't want to give it to them for free. So, they have to succeed on their merits. But it's not that onerous as far as core carrying.
You kind of, you really explained your sector, your industry, really media, and it's enlightening hearing that you're very entrepreneurial yourself, you're very open, but just in your travels and maybe just in your industry, are there other companies that you really, earmark as being as open as yourself? And, like for people like me who might not fall into the media category, what companies do you really have seen throughout your travels that you would really earmark as ones that are really entrepreneurial and have good venture groups and whatnot like that?
Yeah, unfortunately, the venture groups in strategics have fallen by the wayside. There's there's R&D and biz dev groups inside a lot of tech companies, and they do look to mostly towards acquisitions. So Google has a venture group, Yahoo I think still has a venture group. A lot of times their mission is to acquire, but they will invest to acquire, but they're not going to invest like a traditional VC. With today's social tools, I think you can sort of explore, who's open and who's not. I just saw at this event I was at MIT, the folks behind the Domino's, our pizza tastes like cardboard thing, the ad campaign, and relaunch of a product were there. And, there's a company that had to reinvent itself, use the tools to do it, from what their revenues, they did a good job. They had to have a real product, and they had to have an ad campaign that sort of got people interested in it. And so there are businesses that are sort of open-minded and becoming more innovative in every space. I just think there are so many tools you can use to explore it. I think just becoming involved with folks on Twitter and Facebook is really useful. You may find your investor, you may find another job.
Questions?
What's your Twitter handle?
It's GleeMac. I'm GleeMac and everything. It's real easy to find. I own the domain.
Last question of the night. Hands? Somebody? There we go.
I'll take the last one. You've done a good job of helping us understand this whole process from a technology perspective. Can you close by talking a little bit about what's happening on the other side,
Sure.
the business side? How are they really making a determination that, this is really a business?
Sure. So the other side, it's financial analysis, business model analysis. They do the same thing on the staffing. They want to see that the management team is solid. A lot of it is sort of you're putting together a packet that says we've figured out this business is doing X, and here's what our report basically on how we feel about this around legal, financial, business model, product tech, all of those.
Interested in the market.
What's that?
I'm mostly interested in the market. For example, on the technology side, you're trying to make sure, hey, this technology can solve this business problem.
Right.
Okay, I'd really like you to focus just a little bit on what are they doing, what's the real key factors they're looking at to determine, there's a business opportunity here, we think there's a market, we think there are customers, etc.
That depends on the business and the market they're going after. We want to believe that there's a niche in that market that business is going to satisfy, that they're focused on a certain revenue potential. We've yet to invest in a company that's just building before having real revenue. Like we wouldn't invest in Twitter because it's a huge investment in their core, creating that product. Lots of traffic, but I've yet to see how they're going to make money off it. I have no doubt they'll figure out a way to make money. They have some pretty smart VCs behind them, and they have a pretty smart management team. They've proven themselves, but I haven't seen it yet. I use it, but I haven't seen how they're going to make money off of it. But the market side, that's always the hardest question. And for us, we look at broad, again, video games, mobile.
Mike, I want to thank you for coming.
Sure.
Mike Dunn, CTO of Hearst Interactive Media. He'll be up here. We have on the other side Carl from Schooner up there. Feel free to come up and ask questions.